Imagine walking through a jungle where every rustle of a leaf feels like a loaded question. Will I make it another step? Or is someone watching me right now? From somewhere I can't see. This was the daily reality for Marines in the Pacific, not trenches, not open battlefields, but a psychological chess match against ghosts perched high in the trees, Japanese snipers who didn't just shoot to kill. They shot to paralyze entire platoons with fear. Men learned to move hunched over, afraid to straighten their backs. Runners refused to sprint between positions. A single, unseen marksman could freeze 40 Marines in place 4 hours. It wasn't just war. It was psychological suffocation. And then, in one of the most unlikely turns in military history, the tide shifted because of a man no one expected to matter. A carnival worker from Nebraska who brought with him nothing more than intuition, experience, and a belief so simple it sounded insane. Shooters always shoot at targets. All he needed was a stick, a helmet, and the willingness to look ridiculous in the middle of a battlefield. Everything that followed changed Pacific warfare forever. If stories like this fascinate you, the ones buried between the pages of history books, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps more people discover these forgotten moments that genuinely shaped the world. And if you think someone else would love this wild chapter of war psychology, feel free to share it forward. The first thing Marines noticed when they stepped onto islands like Guadalcanal or Bougainville wasn't the heat, or the stench of rotting vegetation, or even the sudden, alien silence of jungles thick enough to swallow sound. It was the feeling, that creeping, unshakable sense that someone was watching them. Not in the normal way you feel observed in battle, where you expect an enemy behind a ridge or inside a trench. No, this was different. This was the sense of being stalked by something you couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't anticipate. Men described it like a pressure at the base of the neck, something primal that made instinct tighten before logic even arrived. They'd take 3 cautious steps through the vines, pause, listen, step again. And then a single crack, sharp, clean, unmistakable, would slice through the canopy. One man would drop. Everyone else would freeze. What haunted them wasn't merely the precision of Japanese snipers, but the fact that more often than not, no one ever saw where the shot came from. Marines weren't fighting an enemy positioned across a field. They were fighting ghosts hung high above them, tied into tree trunks, wrapped in camouflage so perfect it blended with the bark. And these ghosts weren't shooting blindly. They were calm, patient, mathematically precise, marksmen trained not to target bodies, but brain stems, jaws, spinal columns, places where one round meant one kill. The second a Marine lifted his head above cover, even by an inch, that invisible hunter was waiting with a finger already tightening on the trigger. The effect on morale was instantaneous and brutal. Entire platoons began moving like wounded animals, shoulders hunched, helmets pulled low, eyes frantically scanning treetops that always remained stubbornly empty. Men found themselves whispering without realizing it. Some even stopped talking altogether, afraid their own voice might somehow draw a bullet. Instructors back home had never taught them how to fight a vertical war, how to advance when the ground was the safest place and the trees were death. Snipers didn't just kill individuals, they choked movement itself. One shot could pin down 40 men 4 hours. Runner routes collapsed, communications stalled. Officers couldn't coordinate standard formations because every gesture, every raised hand, every turn of the head risked inviting the crack of that 6.5mm round. Marines who had survived mortar barrages and machine gun nests found themselves shaken by a single unseen rifle. And the Japanese knew exactly what they were doing. They had studied the psychology of hesitation before American boots hit the sand, drilling their snipers to hold positions for days, sometimes tied to trees like human barnacles, defecating into bags just to avoid detection. A well-positioned marksman could command entire trails, water points, even the approach to command posts, and he didn't have to fire often. A few shots a day did more damage to Marine effectiveness than a dozen infantrymen with rifles. Every crack reminded the Marines that they weren't merely being hunted, they were being outweighted. By November 1943, medical personnel had coined a term for what they were seeing: sniper neurosis. Men who had marched confidently through boot camp now crawled through the jungle on elbows and knees, flinching at branches snapping in the wind. Some couldn't straighten their backs at all. Their bodies remained permanently curved, as if molded by fear. And why wouldn't they be? Some days, a sniper might fire a single round and then go silent 4 hours, letting Marines believe he had displaced or been killed. The moment someone stood up, optimistic or careless or simply exhausted, the next shot echoed. Snipers didn't just kill, they conditioned. They trained Marines to expect death the moment they behaved like normal soldiers. Commanders tried everything. Machine guns raked the treetops, mortar pounded suspected clusters of palms, even tanks fired into canopies until leaves rained down like shredded paper. But the snipers stayed invisible, or moved, or had already positioned themselves at angles the Marines hadn't considered. The jungle belonged to them, and each casualty report that filtered back to headquarters painted the same infuriating picture: one sniper, firing a handful of rounds, killing 4 or 5 Marines, wounding several more, and shutting down movement across half a mile of terrain. Statistically, a well-placed sniper was more valuable than an entire squad of riflemen. Strategically, he was a nightmare that doctrine had no answer for. So by the time Sergeant Eldridge arrived in the Pacific, the psychological landscape had already shifted. Marines whispered the word sniper with the same dread earlier generations reserved for machine gun nest. A single crack could flood a platoon with adrenaline and immobilize them. Advanced timelines stretched from hours to days. Patrol routes became games of chance. Even experienced officers found themselves hesitating before each step, wondering, is this the moment someone 40 feet above me pulls the trigger? In that world-to-world where death hid in leaves and shadows, fear became as deadly as bullets. And yet, somewhere inside this misery, inside this invisible war against enemies perched in trees, the stage was quietly being set for one of the strangest tactical revolutions in Marine Corps history. Because while everyone else saw an unbeatable sniper problem, one man, a carnival worker turned Marine, was watching the same nightmare unfold and thinking something entirely different. He wasn't analyzing doctrine. He wasn't replaying training from boot camp. He was remembering the shooting gallery back at the Nebraska State Fair, and the simple human truth he'd learned long before he ever held a military rifle: shooters shoot at anything that looks like a target. And the snipers in these trees, they were shooters, which meant somewhere among the fear and the tension and the disbelief, they were vulnerable. Before he ever set foot in a jungle, before he ever crawled through mud under a canopy of invisible rifles, William Eldridge's world was made of laughter, cheap prizes, and the rhythmic clatter of metal ducks sliding across a wooden track. He grew up in the drifting, dust-colored glow of the Nebraska State Fair, a place where the air always smelled faintly of popcorn, oil, and sun-warmed canvas. His family had run the shooting gallery for 3 generations, and to most people, that made the Eldridges carnival folk, not soldiers. But young William absorbed something far more valuable than anyone realized. Day after day, he watched people pick up rifles and try their luck at hitting tin targets. He noticed the way their eyes locked in, the way their fingers tightened at predictable moments, the way hesitation almost never appeared once a target moved into view. People didn't aim because they were trained. They aimed because their brains got tricked into thinking, now, shoot now. Even as a kid, Eldridge understood something simple and strange. Shooters weren't as logical as they believed. They were creatures of reflex, timing, rhythm, almost like musicians following invisible cues. And he watched all of it so closely that eventually he could predict exactly when a stranger would pull the trigger just by how they inhaled. When the attack on Pearl Harbor shook the country awake, Eldridge didn't hesitate. He left behind the fairground lights and enlisted, proud, determined, and absolutely convinced his experience watching tourists shoot at toy targets was worthless. Camp Pendleton only reinforced that belief. Around him were farm boys, factory workers, hunters, athletes, men who carried themselves like they'd been preparing for war their whole lives. Eldridge, by comparison, was quiet, wiry, and a little too observant for comfort. He had this habit of muttering about trigger timing, or the visual commitment window, phrases that made other Marines look at him. He dropped out of a psychology class by mistake. His squad mates joked about him being the carnival professor, a nickname delivered with equal parts affection and confusion. They didn't see the patterns he didn't understand why he paid attention to how men breathed before firing, or how quickly they jerked their rifles after spotting motion. His sergeant even warned him once, "Save that carnival talk for the midway. This is the Marines," so Eldridge stayed quiet. He trained like everyone else, fired his rifle, dug foxholes, rehearsed battle drills. But inside, he kept noticing tiny things no one else saw. The microsecond shifts in posture, the instinctive twitch toward movement, the predictable way shooters reacted to silhouettes. And somehow, all of that lodged itself deep in his mind, waiting for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. That moment finally came on Bougainville. The jungle, there was a cathedral of shadows and damp earth, thick enough to swallow sound and twist perspective. It was the kind of terrain where everything felt too close, the air, the leaves, the danger. Japanese snipers had turned the canopy into their personal kingdom, and Marines moved like reluctant trespassers beneath the invisible throne. 3 days into the campaign, Eldridge's company found itself paralyzed on a narrow trail, pinned down by a sniper no one could spot. 6 Marines in 90 minutes. Each shot felt like a verdict. Officers were shouting orders, mortarmen were firing blindly into trees, and the jungle remained maddeningly silent except for the occasional crack that sent another man falling into the mud. Eldridge watched the bullet impacts, tracking angles, noting timing, and suddenly something old and familiar clicked. It was the same pattern he'd seen on the fairgrounds, the same reflex loop, the same psychological trap. This sniper wasn't supernatural. He was behaving exactly like every tourist back in Nebraska who emptied a pocket full of coins chasing ducks on a track. Reflexive engagement, immediate trigger commitment. No hesitation once a target appeared. Eldridge felt it in his bones. The sniper would shoot at anything that looked like a Marine head, even if it wasn't a real one. So, in the middle of a war zone, with bullets slicing past and officers shouting over one another, Eldridge did the most absurd thing anyone had seen that month. He walked up to his lieutenant, a man exhausted, muddy, and one casualty away from collapsing under the weight of responsibility, and calmly said he needed a helmet, a stick, and 2 minutes. The reaction was immediate laughter, disbelief, irritation. A helmet, a stick. It sounded like the ramblings of someone who'd lost his mind in the humidity. But Eldridge didn't waver. He explained the reflex loop, the predictable trigger response, the way shooters get locked into firing at anything that resembles a moving target. He told his lieutenant they were fighting the sniper's game by the sniper's rules and losing. His plan: flip the rules, bait the sniper into shooting at nothing, make him reveal himself, break his psychological advantage. It was ludicrous, it was desperate, and yet, it made a certain kind of strange, undeniable sense. When a stretcher passed by with a teenager bleeding from a shot to the jaw, the lieutenant's face changed. Desperation softened into resignation, and in that moment, the fate of one of the Pacific War's strangest tactical revolutions was sealed. Because the lieutenant exhaled, looked at Eldridge, and muttered the 5 words no one expected: "Fine, don't get yourself killed." The moment Eldridge jammed the helmet onto the end of that branch, every Marine around him went silent. Not the tense, fearful silence they'd grown used to under sniper fire, but a deeper, stranger one. This was the silence reserved for witnessing something so absurd, so wildly out of place in a war zone, that the mind had to briefly step outside itself and ask, is this really happening? Eldridge crouched behind a fallen log, mud caked up to his elbows, sweat dripping down his jawline. He tested the weight of the helmet, adjusting the balance the same way he used to test the resistance of the duck track at the carnival. Around him, men watched with a mix of pity, confusion, and horrified fascination. Even the lieutenant, who had reluctantly given permission, hovered nearby with the half-expected dread that he might end up writing a casualty report about a man who died waving a helmet on a stick. The air felt thick, charged, stretched thin between disaster and miracle. Eldridge inhaled slowly, remembering years of watching shooters commit to targets without thought. Then, with steady hands, he lifted the helmet above the log just a few inches at first, letting it bob ever so slightly like someone easing their head up to look around the brush. The crack of the sniper's rifle came almost instantly, ripping through the silence like a whip. The helmet jerked hard as the bullet punched straight through the steel, spinning slightly on the stick from the force of impact. Gasps erupted, curses followed, and several Marines instinctively ducked lower, even though they were already fully covered. But Eldridge barely flinched. His eyes stayed locked on the angle of the impact, the timing of the shot, the faint shiver of leaves where he suspected the muzzle flash had come from. If anything, the shot energized him. He took the bait, Eldridge thought, not with triumph, but with a quiet, clinical certainty. He waved the helmet again, shifting the angle. Another crack, another hole. The sniper was firing as predictably as any carnival customer trying to knock down a tin rabbit. Reflex, pattern, compulsion. In the span of 2 shots, Eldridge had confirmed everything he'd ever believed about the psychology of shooters. The sniper wasn't some supernatural jungle phantom. He was human-trained, disciplined, deadly, yes, but human. And humans obey reflex far more often than logic. Behind Eldridge, Corporal James Henshaw, the company's best marksman, was tracking each shot with a precision that mirrored Eldridge's intuition. By the time the 3rd round sliced through the helmet, Henshaw had located the faint glimmer of muzzle flash 80 yards northeast, high in the fronds of a coconut palm. It wasn't much, barely a flicker, but it was enough. Eldridge paused the movement, then bobbed the helmet one more time. Crack, 4th shot. Same angle, same tree. That was all Henshaw needed. He settled into a prone firing position, exhaled slowly, and let instinct and training merge. His Springfield barked one deliberate, controlled shot, and then came a silence heavier than the gunfire that preceded it. 10 seconds, 20, a full minute. No more cracks from above. No more invisible hunter stalking the trail. Just the murmurs of Marines rising cautiously, eyes fixed on the treetops, waiting to see if a 5th shot would punish their hope. None came. When the realization sank in that the impossible had happened, that a helmet on a stick had just beaten a sniper, no one could pin down 4 hours. The reaction was explosive. Marines laughed the raw, relieved laughter that only men who have skirted death can truly produce. Some slapped Eldridge on the back, others clapped their hands in disbelief. One even shouted, "I'll be damned, it worked," as if the jungle itself needed to hear it. Eldridge, still kneeling behind the log, examined the helmet with its neat cluster of holes and muttered the same line he'd muttered 1,000 times at the fair, "Told you." Just like the ducks, but this wasn't a carnival, this was Bougainville. And that ridiculous, borderline suicidal stunt had just saved a platoon from bleeding out on a trail they couldn't advance or retreat from. Wood spread so fast it outran the men who carried it. Within 48 hours, every rifle company in the division had heard about the helmet trick. Some treated it as a fluke, others as a miracle, and a few officers even dismissed it as dangerous nonsense that would get someone killed. But those who'd witnessed it The men who'd seen Eldridge calmly manipulate reflexes drilled into Japanese doctrine knew something fundamental had shifted. The jungle no longer felt like a one-sided psychological battlefield. The snipers weren't ghosts anymore. They were predictable. They could be provoked. And most importantly, they could be lured into revealing themselves. Eldridge hadn't just broken a stalemate that day. He'd cracked open an invisible wall that had been choking Marine movement since Guadalcanal. He proved that the sniper's advantage, a perfect blend of concealment, patience, and doctrine, wasn't invincible. It had a flaw, a human flaw, and all it took to expose it was a helmet, a stick, and one man who knew exactly how shooters think. In the days that followed, platoons quietly experimented with variations of Eldridge's trick. Some tried waving helmets faster, others slower, some bobbed them. Others drifted them sideways through gaps in the foliage. And every time a sniper took the bait, every time a muzzle flash betrayed a hidden perch, Marines learned something new. Fear didn't have to dominate the treetops anymore. For the first time in months, the ghosts were blinking. To understand why Eldridge's helmet trick worked so flawlessly, you have to step inside the mind of a sniper, not the Hollywood version with dramatic breathing and slow-motion focus, but the real psychological machinery ticking inside a trained marksman, perched 30 to 60 feet above the jungle floor. Japanese snipers, especially those trained at the Nanao School, weren't taught to be hunters in the romantic sense. They were conditioned, almost engineered, to follow a strict sequence of engagement: spot target, acquire sight picture, commit, fire. Their doctrine emphasized immediacy because hesitation was considered failure. Their instructors drilled into them the principle of ichi hatsu, one target, one shot. This wasn't about conserving ammo. It was about achieving psychological dominance. A sniper who didn't fire at an exposed helmet risked letting the enemy close in, reposition, or detect his perch. So each time a helmet silhouette appeared, even a fake one, the sniper's training activated like a pressure switch. Eldridge instinctively understood this because he'd grown up watching thousands of people shoot at fake targets every day. The human brain doesn't distinguish between real and simulated danger quickly. When a familiar shape moves the way your training says it should, the decision to shoot doesn't pass through slow, conscious evaluation. It leaps straight from visual recognition to motor reflex. And reflex, once triggered, is incredibly hard to interrupt. Neurologically, what happened inside a sniper's brain the moment a helmet appeared was almost automatic. Visual information traveled from the retina to the occipital cortex, where the outline of the helmet was recognized as a combat-relevant object. From there, the brain sent a cascade of signals to the motor cortex, initiating the firing sequence. Under stress, heat, hunger, exhaustion, the constant dread of being discovered, this pathway became even more streamlined. Combat doesn't make people careful, it makes them reactive. The Japanese sniper doctrine unintentionally made this reflex even sharper by training marksmen to fear hesitation more than waste. As long as the silhouette looked real enough, moved with the right rhythm, and appeared briefly just long enough to mimic a Marine cautiously rising behind cover, the sniper's brain filled in the blanks. To him, it was a Marine, Eldridge, without any formal training in neuroscience, tapped directly into this reflex arc. He didn't need textbooks. He had decades of watching shooters get locked in at the carnival. Every time someone stepped up to the booth, their eyes tracked the ducks and their fingers twitched in perfect sync with the target's movement. It wasn't intelligence, it was instinct. And instinct is exploitable. But what made this trick devastating wasn't just the brain's fast reflex, it was the sniper's environment. Perched high in the canopy, tied to trunks with rope harnesses, Japanese snipers operated in a sensory tunnel. Leaves blocked peripheral vision. Sunlight flickered in distracting shards. Sweat stung their eyes. They had to remain absolutely still for hours, sometimes days, with insects crawling across their skin and the jungle pressing in like a damp vice. In that mental state, ambiguity becomes the enemy. A silhouette rising, movement in the corner of your eye. Your brain screams target before your reasoning can whisper wait. And because hesitation was doctrinally punished, delay equals detection equals death, the sniper was trapped in a psychological vice: shoot reflexively or risk being overrun. Eldridge's helmet movements exploited this exact tension. He waved the helmet at the same speed as a Marine's cautious advance. He bobbed it with small hesitations that looked like a man adjusting his position. The brain of the sniper didn't analyze, didn't have time to. All it saw was a moving target that perfectly matched the rhythm of real combat movement. Untrained reflex doesn't ask permission, it fires. Then came the final, critical piece of the puzzle: commitment bias. Once a sniper fired at the first decoy, his brain locked into a behavioral loop. Having fired once, he was even more likely to fire again, because to stop and question the target would require conscious override, something slow, deliberate, and dangerous in a combat scenario. Eldridge's carnival experience told him that after someone fired the first round at a moving duck, their accuracy and restraint plummeted. They became emotionally invested, determined to hit what they believed they should hit. Japanese snipers were no different. Once they squeezed that first trigger, their brain dug in deeper, they committed. And when Eldridge shifted the helmet slightly, showing a different angle, the sniper fired again and again. Each shot made his position clearer. Each shot made him easier to kill. The irony was brutal. The more skilled the sniper, the more likely he was to fall for the trap. Patience, discipline, and reflex, the very tools that made Japanese marksmen so feared, became the levers Eldridge used to dismantle them. This was the genius of the helmet trick. It didn't overpower snipers. It didn't outgun them. It simply let their training defeat them, bullet by bullet, reflex by reflex, until they revealed themselves and lost the one advantage they depended on: invisibility. Tarawa wasn't a battlefield. It was a furnace. A 76-hour storm of sand, smoke, blood, and chaos so intense that even hardened Marines later struggled to describe it without pausing to gather themselves. The island was barely large enough to fit a small town, yet it held one of the most heavily fortified Japanese positions of the entire Pacific campaign. When the Marines hit the beaches on November 20th, 1943, they expected resistance. What they didn't expect were the snipers, survivors of the naval bombardment, tucked into shattered bunkers, crouched beneath collapsed palm trunks, hidden inside the skeletal remains of buildings, and perched in treetops that somehow still clung to life amid the destruction. These marksmen weren't firing with desperation. They were patient, methodical, viciously precise. Marines thought they had secured an area, only 4 shots to ring out from places that looked dead moments before. 2nd Marine Division casualty reports from that first day read 38 confirmed sniper kills, a number so shockingly high it forced commanders to reconsider everything they thought they understood about urbanized island warfare. Moving even a few feet without cover felt like volunteering for a bullet. And by the time Eldridge's unit was tasked with clearing a strong point on day 2, Tarawa had become a riddle written in sand and blood. How do you fight an enemy at sea, on an island too small to maneuver, and too fortified to blast apart? Eldridge had no illusions about what they were walking into. The strong point they were ordered to take consisted of twisted, half-collapsed bunkers connected by buried firing niches and reinforced chambers. Intelligence suggested at least 3 snipers had interlocking fields of fire covering the approach. Normally, that would mean calling in artillery or airstrikes, then sending in a squad to sweep what was left. But artillery couldn't risk friendly fire at such close range, and air support couldn't get clear visual lines of attack amid the smoke and debris. So the platoon leader, who had seen Eldridge's Bougainville stunt with his own eyes, did something that would have sounded insane in any other context. He told Eldridge to set up his helmet stations. 4 Marines stepped forward with bamboo poles, roughly 5 feet each, and battered helmets perched on the ends. These weren't volunteers in the heroic sense. They were Marines who trusted Eldridge, who had watched him turn a suicidal idea into a tactical miracle, and who understood that, if the snipers weren't flushed out, everyone in the platoon was dead anyway. The plan was simple, almost laughably so. Wave one helmet, wait for the shot, mark the angle. Wave another helmet at a different point, force each sniper to reveal himself. Behind each decoy operator lay a Marine sniper with a Springfield rifle, breathing slow, waiting for that brief flicker of muzzle flash. At 0830 the operation began. The first helmet rose just a few inches above the rubble and hovered, bobbing gently to mimic a Marine moving cautiously between broken walls. The reaction was instantaneous, a crack, sharp and unmistakable, the bullet tearing through the decoy in a perfect, lethal line. A counter-sniper marked the flash, the second helmet rose, and another shot followed from a different angle. The third helmet appeared, and the third sniper fired. In less than 60 seconds, the location of 3 invisible killers had been exposed, not by overwhelming firepower, not by elaborate maneuver, but by simple, human reflex. What followed was 2 hours of astonishingly controlled chaos. Eldridge coordinated a sequence of helmet movements, rotating operators, and generating unpredictable silhouettes. Every time a helmet appeared, 1 or more Japanese snipers fired. Some snipers missed the decoys entirely because they rushed a shot. Others hit perfectly, burying round after round into helmets that cost nothing. Meanwhile, the counter-snipers behind Eldridge calmly tracked the flashes and took their shots one by one. At 8:45, the first Japanese sniper was killed. At 9:20, the second fell. At 9:53, the third. But something unexpected happened next, something that stunned even Eldridge. Snipers from adjacent positions, hearing what they believed was a sudden flood of exposed Marine targets, joined the engagement. They fired into the open, unaware they were being baited into the same psychological trap. By the time the decoy operators lowered their sticks for the final time that morning, early light shifting across the mangled strongpoint, Marine marksmen had confirmed 11 Japanese snipers killed. 11, all exposed, all neutralized, all drawn out by helmets bobbing on sticks. The cost: 4 helmets punched full of holes, a handful of tired arms, and not a single Marine casualty. None, in an operation that should have cost between 8 to 10 men dead, and twice that wounded. Eldridge's carnival logic had turned a near-suicidal assault into a flawless sweep. When the battalion commander arrived to inspect the scene, he didn't speak at first. He simply watched the holes in the helmets, the bent poles, the killed-in-place sniper nests, and the Marines standing around with the dazed relief of men who just witnessed something close to magic. Finally, he turned to Eldridge and asked quietly, "Can you teach this?" But what Eldridge had introduced wasn't merely a tactic. It was a psychological counteroffensive. For the first time in the war, Japanese snipers weren't the hunters, they were the hunted. Their rigid doctrine, once a strength, had become a weakness. Their reflex to fire was no longer a weapon. It was a leash, and Tarawa marked the turning point. A ridiculous idea had become a repeatable tactic, and a tactic was on its way to becoming doctrine. Long before Eldridge ever waved a helmet on a stick, Japanese logisticians were already losing sleep over one fundamental truth of Pacific warfare: ammunition was a luxury. Every sniper deployed to island garrisons carried roughly 120 rounds, 6 stripper clips of 20 each. On paper, that seemed enough for weeks of disciplined engagement. In reality, it was a ticking clock. Japanese supply lines were stretched thin, strangled by American submarines, battered by air raids, and choked by the sheer distance between home islands and the scattered dots of volcanic rock they were ordered to defend. Resupply was unreliable on a good day and impossible on most. Snipers were instructed to treat ammunition like life itself, precious, irreplaceable. never wasted. Their doctrine assumed they would take maybe 15 shots a day at most, each one carefully chosen, each one intended to kill. But that doctrine had a fatal blind spot. It assumed the enemy would behave predictably. It couldn't imagine Marines deliberately creating targets that demanded immediate engagement, forcing snipers to drain their pouches in hours instead of weeks. When Eldridge introduced the helmet trick, he wasn't just exposing snipers. He was burning their lifelines. Every decoy shot wasn't merely a failed kill. It was a piece of their survival evaporating into the jungle air. The brilliance of the tactic came from how quietly and quickly it damaged the enemy. A sniper might begin a deployment with 120 rounds. Enough, theoretically, for an entire campaign if used wisely. But 4 decoys, running for 2 hours, could pull more than 40 shots out of him. That meant a full third of his ammunition gone before he'd even fired at a real Marine. And once a sniper burned through that many rounds, something subtle but devastating began to happen: hesitation. Reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show a clear shift in Japanese sniper behavior. Marksmen who once fired confidently at every exposed helmet silhouette started pausing longer. They hesitated on shots that should have been routine. Marines advancing through likely sniper zones noticed that movement that should have drawn immediate fire sometimes passed unchallenged. In one instance on New Britain, an entire squad walked by a sniper who had previously been responsible for multiple kills, only to discover later that he had a mere 7 rounds left and was saving them for what he hoped would be a decisive final engagement. Ammunition scarcity wasn't just a logistical problem, it was psychological erosion. A sniper who feared running dry ceased to be a predator. He became a man rationing seconds of usefulness, terrified of wasting the last bullets that defined his purpose. Captured Japanese documents from island after island reflected this growing panic. On Guadalcanal, after-action reports described sniper teams rendered combat ineffective not because they were dead, but because enemy deception required excessive ammunition use. On Saipan, surviving snipers abandoned their carefully prepared perches after expending 70 rounds with negligible enemy casualties achieved. These weren't exaggerations, they were confessions. The enemy was being baited, drained, and slowly starved of the very tool that made them dangerous. For the Japanese, this breakdown was catastrophic. Snipers were supposed to be force multipliers, one man controlling the movement of dozens. But a sniper with 20 rounds left, perched in a tree with no hope of resupply, was no longer a controlling force. He was an observer, a witness, a ghost stripped of teeth. Marines advancing beneath these compromised snipers could feel the shift. Areas that should have been certain death could now be crossed with cautious confidence. In the early days of the war, Marines feared the canopy. By mid-1944, the canopy feared them, and the numbers confirmed it. Sniper-caused casualties fell by nearly 40% across multiple campaigns, despite terrain that should have favored defensive marksmen. The helmet trick wasn't merely saving lives, it was altering the tactical ecosystem. The true scale of this transformation became undeniable during the battle for Iwo Jima, when Marines captured enemy position maps from a shattered command bunker. They found sniper nests color-coded by ammunition status. Red meant critical, of 43 sniper positions marked, 37 were red. These weren't empty positions, they were still occupied by men who could scarcely fire. Annotations translated by Nisei interpreters repeatedly referenced enemy deception, resupply impossible, and position effectiveness degraded. Snipers had bullets in their rifles, but fear in their hearts. They were conserved into irrelevance. Eldridge's simple trick had turned a fearsome weapon into a limited-use asset, something the Japanese couldn't afford to expend. And once ammunition scarcity took root, the psychological tables turned completely. Marines no longer advanced wondering whether a hidden sniper would fire. they advanced wondering whether he could. The helmet trick had weaponized the enemy's biggest weakness, their dependence on scarce ammunition and rigid doctrine. It didn't just beat snipers, it broke their strategic value. It took the ghosts in the trees and starved them into shadows. And without ever firing a shot itself, it rewrote the balance of the Pacific War. When the Marine Corps first heard about Eldridge's helmet trick, the initial reaction wasn't celebration, it was discomfort. The military doesn't like ideas that break the mold, especially when those ideas come from someone without rank, pedigree, or tactical pedigree. Doctrine is supposed to rise from war colleges, not carnivals. Yet by early 1944, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Casualty numbers on Bougainville and Tarawa reflected a pattern. Wherever Eldridge's decoys were used, sniper losses rose and Marine deaths fell. Something that shouldn't have worked was working. Still, headquarters couldn't simply copy a battlefield stunt and write it into official manuals. There were egos, traditions, and a deeply rooted belief that real tactics came from real soldiers. So when Eldridge was ordered back to Camp Pendleton to demonstrate his method before a working group of officers, he found himself standing in front of men with ribbons on their chests and skepticism in their eyes. They expected some kind of secret technique, a cleverly engineered system. Instead, they watched a quiet, unassuming sergeant place a helmet on a stick and explain, in carnival language, how human beings instinctively fire at anything that looks like a target. Half the room shifted uncomfortably, the other half leaned forward. What they were witnessing wasn't elegant. It wasn't scholarly, but it was undeniable. The simplest idea in the Pacific was outsmarting the deadliest shooters on it. Still, the Marine Corps had no intention of printing a field manual that credited a carnival worker with revolutionizing counter-sniper operations. Bureaucracy has its pride. So the working group translated Eldridge's method into formal, polished, doctrinal language. Where Eldridge said wave the helmet, like someone's peeking up, the manual read, present a realistic combat silhouette employing irregular vertical elevation. Where Eldridge said, don't stand behind it, unless you want a hole in your head, the manual declared, operator must maintain positional offset to reduce exposure. And his simple bamboo pole became a portable extension device. It was almost comedic, watching plain-spoken carnival logic dressed in the stiff vocabulary of military academia. But the transformation served a purpose. It made the tactic respectable. Officers who would never admit they were copying a sergeant's battlefield improvisation were perfectly comfortable implementing decoy-initiated counter-sniper protocol. The name changed. The structure changed. The spirit did not. Yet doctrine alone wasn't what made the tactic spread. It was the Marines who returned from the field, men who had watched Eldridge's idea save their friends, who carried the technique forward. They improvised, experimented, and refined it into something even more effective than Eldridge had imagined. That experimentation became the soul of the tactic. A corporal from Iowa added weight inside the helmet, so it swayed with more lifelike momentum. A Marine from Texas discovered that dragging the helmet slowly across an opening provoked more shots than lifting it vertically. One squad realized that if they held the helmet still for several seconds, then jerked it suddenly, snipers fired at the abrupt movement almost every time. Another unit stitched fake camouflage netting to the helmets to mimic the silhouettes of officers. A particularly clever company on Peleliu bent wire into makeshift antennas, attaching them to helmets, so they resembled radio men, the highest value sniper targets. Marines began choreographing movements the way dancers refine steps, slow rise, pause, sway, quick drop. To smooth, and it looked fake, to erratic, and the sniper hesitated. The sweet spot was something halfway between trained caution and natural motion, the subtle, uneven rhythm of a human trying not to die. Instructors at Camp Pendleton started teaching these variations in dedicated training blocks. Recruits practiced behind sandbag walls, lifting helmets on poles and studying each other's timing. What had once been a desperate field improvisation was now structured training with cadence, rhythm, and specific best practices. By mid-1944, the transformation was complete. The helmet trick, once dismissed as reckless, had become standard operating procedure across the Pacific. Units deployed to Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima carried their decoy kits alongside rifles and radio gear. Helmets were drilled with holes, so they moved naturally. Poles were cut to precise lengths. Some companies even assigned designated decoy operators, Marines chosen for their steady hands and nerves of steel. The Japanese noticed. Captured documents revealed frantic directives urging snipers to slow down, verify targets, and resist the impulse to fire at every helmet silhouette. They even listed recognition factors to avoid falling for decoys, look for neck shadows, examine gait patterns, confirm shoulder movement, but this was doomed from the start. These instructions required time required stillness, and stillness gave Marines the advantage. A sniper who paused to verify a target risked letting real Marines advance. A sniper who hesitated became less effective. Doctrine that once commanded shoot instantly was now telling them to wait, and in war, contradictory instincts are deadly. Snipers began dying not because they fired too soon, but because they couldn't decide whether to fire at all. Their greatest strength, reflexive aggression, had become a trap. Their surviving snipers weren't acting with confidence. They were acting with doubt, and doubt is the first crack in any doctrine. By the time the Marines launched their major offensives in mid-1944, the Pacific had transformed into a living laboratory for Eldridge's strange, brilliant idea. What began as a desperate stunt on Bougainville was now turning entire battlefields into controlled experiments in psychological warfare. On Saipan, the jungle wasn't as dense as Bougainville, but the ridges, ravines, and jagged coral outcroppings created perfect sniping perches. Japanese marksmen had spent months preparing overlapping kill zones designed to funnel Marines into predictable paths. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a shooting gallery, except the Marines now controlled the gallery. Companies advancing through the island carried decoy poles the way earlier generations carried entrenching tools. In one engagement near Hill 500, a rifle company recorded using the helmet trick 43 times in just 8 days, drawing an estimated 300 sniper shots. 300 bullets the enemy could never replace. 300 chances for counter-snipers to spot the thin flash of a muzzle. 300 opportunities to pull ghosts out of the treetops. The result, the company suffered only 2 sniper casualties during that period, an almost impossible number considering the terrain. For the first time, snipers weren't shaping battle conditions. They were reacting to them, and every time they reacted, they lost. The ripple effect was staggering. Traditionally, snipers disrupt movement, slow advances, and bleed momentum from offensive operations. But once the helmet trick went wide, entire assault timetables began shrinking. On Tinian, platoons that would normally spend half an hour clearing a grove did it in minutes. On Guam, Marines reported advancing through suspected sniper zones with confidence bordering on surreal. Not recklessness, but a grounded belief that the enemy's deadliest tool had been blunted. Even when a helmet trick didn't immediately expose a sniper, it still accomplished something crucial. It forced the enemy to stay quiet. Silence meant hesitation, and hesitation meant the Marines could move. Every moment a sniper refused to fire at a real target because he feared wasting ammunition on a fake one was a silent victory. Those victories didn't make the after-action reports. They didn't create dramatic stories, but they saved lives, thousands of them. In some places, entire battalions recorded days without a single sniper casualty, something that would have been unthinkable in early 1943. Officers began realizing that the helmet trick wasn't just a tactic, it was a climate changer. It reshaped how Marines felt as they moved through terrain once synonymous with death. Instead of flinching at every crackle of leaves overhead, Marines began treating the jungle as contested ground, not haunted territory. But nowhere was the transformation clearer than Peleliu. The island was a nightmare of coral ridges, caves, and sniper nests so meticulously prepared that some historians still argue it was the worst terrain American forces fought through in the entire war. Japanese defenders had spent months carving firing positions into limestone, creating shadowed holes with perfect sightlines stretching hundreds of yards. It should have been a slaughter, yet over and over, reports describe the same pattern. Decoys deployed, snipers firing reflexively, counter-snipers eliminating them. A tactic born from carnival intuition was neutralizing some of the most disciplined marksmen in the Imperial Army. One platoon leader described the experience this way: "It felt like we were pulling threads out of the enemy's sweater." One tug, and another sniper came loose. Snipers who did try to conserve ammo found themselves trapped in a new dilemma. If they didn't shoot, Marines moved closer. If they did shoot, they exposed themselves. Either way, they lost. The helmet trick had turned a once invincible battlefield predator into something almost pitiful. A soldier forced to choose between breaking doctrine or dying by it. And as more snipers were pulled from ridgelines and caves, advances that should have stalled instead surged forward. Then came Iwo Jima, the final, brutal confirmation of how profoundly the decoy tactic had reshaped the Pacific. When Marines overran a command bunker and found the color-coded map marking sniper ammunition status, it felt like a revelation. Red indicators littered the map, not because positions were destroyed, but because snipers simply had nothing left to fire. They had been drained, bled dry by helmets on sticks. The most feared shooters in the Imperial Army had become observers with empty belts. Even the Japanese commanders admitted as much in their own scribbled notes, referencing enemy deception and lost positions due to ammunition consumption. And while the helmet trick didn't erase the horror of Iwo Jima, nothing could. It undeniably prevented the catastrophe that might have been. Division medical officers estimated that if sniper casualties had remained at Tarawa levels through Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the Marines would have suffered at least 4,000 additional sniper-related deaths and injuries. 4,000 men who lived, who went home, who grew old, because a carnival worker understood human behavior better than any field manual. And yet, no medals were pinned for the idea itself. No parades honored the tactic. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glorious. It was quiet, subtle, almost invisible, just like the enemy it defeated. But in that silence, countless lives were saved, real lives. Lives that continued because one man asked the simplest question no one else thought to ask: what if the ghost in the trees can be tricked? When the war finally ended and the world began stitching itself back together, William Eldridge didn't return home as a conquering hero. He stepped off a bus in Lincoln, Nebraska, carrying a duffel bag, a battered service cap, and a silence that only combat veterans truly wear. The Pacific was still clinging to him, not in the way of souvenirs or stories, but in the quiet, heavy way trauma nests itself under the ribs. His father was waiting at the station, leaning against his old truck, though time had barely passed. "How was it?" he asked, a question so impossibly large it barely made sense. Eldridge simply said, "Fine," because that's what veterans say when they've lived through things they don't want to explain. There were no welcoming committees, no crowds, no cameras. Just the dusty Nebraska wind and a father who didn't ask for more. Eldridge rode home with the window down, letting the cold air sting his face, as if it might scrub away everything he'd seen. He didn't talk about snipers. He didn't talk about the helmet trick. He didn't talk about Tarawa or Bougainville or the terrible arithmetic of lives saved versus lives he couldn't save. He just went home. The shooting gallery was still there, exactly where he'd left it. The same metal ducks clattered along the same tracks. The same bell dinged when someone hit a target dead center. The same chipped paint on the booth corners, the same faint scent of oil and sawdust. He stepped behind the counter almost automatically, as though the 3 years he'd spent fighting through jungles and ridges had been replaced by a long weekend. Only one thing was different: Eldridge himself. He no longer watched people play for amusement. He watched them with the analytical gaze of a man who had seen shooters under circumstances where missing didn't mean losing a prize. It meant dying. He noticed how people leaned forward when they aimed, how their fingers twitched before committing to a shot, how they breathed without realizing it. Customers thought he'd gotten particular about the game, sometimes leaning over and quietly adjusting their posture or talking to them about sight alignment. To them, he was just a quirky veteran with strong opinions on marksmanship. They had no idea he had used those exact observations to turn the tide of battles thousands of miles away. And Eldridge didn't tell them. In his mind, the shooting gallery was a place where things were simple, predictable, harmless. A place where a missed shot meant nothing, a place untouched by war. His Bronze Star citation arrived in the mail one afternoon, forwarded from Marine Corps headquarters. It was neatly typed, politely worded, and as understated as Eldridge himself. It credited him with exceptional ingenuity in developing counter-sniper techniques that significantly reduced casualties across multiple campaigns. He read it once, nodded slightly, and set it aside. It went into a drawer, not a frame. When people asked about it, usually other veterans at the VFW, who noticed the ribbon when he wore it on rare occasions, he offered the same explanation every time. It was just common sense. He never talked about how terrified he'd been the first time he lifted that helmet above a log on Bougainville. He never mentioned the weight of responsibility he felt knowing that one wrong move could get another Marine killed. He didn't talk about the pressure of holding a ridiculous idea together with nothing but instinct and hope. Eldridge didn't see himself as a hero or an innovator. In his own mind, he was still the carnival kid, the one who watched people shoot at mechanical ducks for most of his life. The war hadn't changed that. If anything, it had made the simplicity of those ducks even more sacred to him. As the decades passed, Eldridge became a quiet fixture at the fair, the man who had been there longer than almost anyone could remember. Children grew up, had kids of their own, and brought them back to the gallery. Eldridge aged gently, the way people do when they don't ask for much from the world. When he died in 1987, at the age of 71, the Lincoln Journal-Star obituary mentioned his Marine Corps service in a single sentence. The rest was about his 50 years at the fair. No one wrote about Bougainville. No one mentioned Tarawa. No one knew that thousands of Marines owed their lives in part to the man behind that booth. And if anyone had told him that history had largely forgotten his contribution, he probably would have shrugged. Because Eldridge never cared about the credits. He cared about the men who didn't die. He cared about the common sense idea that changed entire campaigns. And he cared about a world where the only targets that needed shooting were tin ducks moving along a track. In the end, he remained exactly who he had been from the beginning, a man who understood how people behave when they see something that looks like a target. A man who saw patterns others didn't. A man who saved lives not with firepower, but with a stick, a helmet, and a quiet sort of brilliance he never felt the need to boast about. Long after the war ended, long after the shooting gallery in Nebraska became just another nostalgic corner of a county fair, Eldridge's simple idea kept echoing through the halls of military training centers, often uncredited, sometimes misunderstood, but always present. The Korean War introduced new challenges: frozen ridgelines, enemy sharpshooters dug into rock caves, visibility reduced to whatever the snow and fog allowed. Yet the principles held. Marines and soldiers used helmet decoys to lure out enemy marksmen hidden along the 38th parallel, drawing fire from snipers who believed they had a perfect shot. In Vietnam, where the jungle returned with all its suffocating density, the tactic evolved again. The enemy's doctrine was different, the terrain harsher, the engagement ranges shorter, but the psychology remained the same. Movements mimicking human silhouettes triggered reflexive engagements. The US military adapted Eldridge's technique into everything, from helmet rakes to pop-up silhouette boards to controlled bait shots during night operations. New materials replaced sticks, fiberglass replaced steel. But at its heart, it was still the same idea: use the enemy's reflexes against them. What had begun as a desperate attempt to break a deadlock in a tropical jungle had quietly, persistently shaped the next generation of counter-sniper strategy. Even as modern conflicts shifted toward urban combat and insurgency warfare, the core insight behind Eldridge's trick didn't fade. It expanded. Tactical deception became a formal discipline, studied in classrooms and applied in war zones. Soldiers in Afghanistan used portable mannequins, weighted coverings, and even thermal decoys to draw out insurgent marksmen waiting in mud brick windows. Sniper teams in Iraq deployed bait silhouettes on rooftops to provoke fire from distant riflemen hiding behind shattered concrete. Drone operators used artificial movement patterns to coax enemy shooters into giving away positions from half a mile off. And analysts studying engagement footage kept noticing the same thing Eldridge had noticed decades earlier. Once a shooter commits to a perceived target, overriding that impulse is nearly impossible. His insight that humans are slaves to visual stimulus and motor reflex under stress now lives in the algorithms that train artificial vision systems to predict when someone is about to fire. It shapes moving target drills used by elite marksmen. It even appears in manuals that reference stimulus-induced firing behavior, a sterile academic phrase built from the bones of a carnival worker's intuition. Eldridge's name isn't there. It never is. But the ghost of his idea lingers in every paragraph. What makes Eldridge's legacy so quietly powerful is that it didn't rely on advanced technology or top-secret intelligence. It wasn't born in a research lab. It wasn't the result of a task force or a committee. It was born in the dust of a fairground where mechanical ducks rolled past wide-eyed kids holding BB guns. It emerged from watching thousands of ordinary people respond to simple stimuli and realizing that even trained killers, perched high in jungle trees, were still human. They were governed by instinct, rhythm, timing, and the illusions that trick the brain into reacting before it reasons. Modern military psychologists now talk openly about reflex hijacking and trigger loop exploitation, phrases that would have sounded like science fiction in the 1940s. Yet Eldridge understood the fundamentals before the terminology existed. He recognized that the line between expertise and vulnerability is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Snipers trained to dominate the battlefield were undone not by superior firepower, but by a simple question: what happens if you give them something they can't resist shooting at? The Marines of the Pacific built upon that question until it became a doctrine that saved lives across oceans and decades. And maybe that's the part of the story that resonates more now than ever. War is often told through the lens of grand strategies, heroic charges, and the movements of armies, but sometimes its turning points are quieter, built from the kind of common-sense brilliance that doesn't look like genius until you examine its consequences. Eldridge never claimed he changed the war. He never lectured anyone about behavioral psychology or tactical deception. He just knew what he knew, trusted the instincts shaped by a lifetime of watching people try to hit targets, and did the simplest thing imaginable. He applied it where it mattered most. His trick didn't earn him fame. It didn't earn headlines. It earned peace for men who lived because a sniper missed a shot, or fired at the wrong silhouette, or revealed himself at exactly the wrong moment. That is its legacy, not medals, not monuments, but lives quietly preserved. And in a way, that's fitting, because the genius of Eldridge's idea was never loud or complicated. It was small, human, and honest. It was a helmet on a stick in the middle of a war. A silly idea that wasn't silly at all, just true. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary changes in history come from ordinary people who see patterns no one else sees. And long after the shooting stopped, that simple truth kept echoing: shooters shoot at targets, even when the target isn't real.